So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachel Elrod. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Associate Chair of Departmental Libraries and the Director of the Education Library at the University of Florida. This year, I have had the privilege of chairing the Education and Behavioral Sciences section of ACRL. I'm also the chair of the EBSS Conference Program Presentation Committee. The program you will see today was originally scheduled to be presented and co-sponsored with the Digital Scholarship section of ACRL at this year's ALA Annual. But we decided to move to a discussion forum format to allow for greater participation and a conversation of an important and timely topic. The title of today's discussion, Data Visualization for Social Justice, was inspired both by the current state of affairs in our country and our world, and by the closing keynote presentation on data visualization at the most recent ACRL conference. We hope that you will enjoy the presentation from our speakers. I want to start by sharing that Catherine Nicole Coleman may not be able to be here today. She has been called to civic duty, and she has sent a pre-recorded presentation for us. But we're going to go ahead and start with Scarlett Galvin. Scarlett is the collection strategist librarian and area lead for assessment and planning at Grand Valley State University. She leads efforts towards a justice-centered, sustainable collection. Her research focuses on the socio-political aspects of library services platforms and resource management. Her recent work includes keynotes at VALA, Libraries, Technology in the Future, and the North Carolina Serials Conference. She is a member of SPARC's Executive Steering Committee and an editor for Weave, Journal of Library User Experience. I will now turn it over to Scarlett.
Hi, we've been doing sound checks, but Mercury is retrograde. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good, excellent. So I don't have slides because I wanted this to be a little bit more of a conversation, which can kind of head to the end of the presentation. But I can see chat right now, since I think at some point in one of the last few updates, folks over at Zoom realized that having the chat pop out will be helpful. So today I'm going to be talking about and asking, what might be some just design principles for library dashboards, because that's where I interact with visualization probably the most in my role, is looking at how do we visualize collections, how do we visualize collections data and user activity in those contexts, and kind of looking for frameworks in order maybe to make that happen in a way that is more just and that maybe communicates value or impact differently than the metrics that were kind of traditional or at this point, kind of traditional, inherent to the neoliberal enterprise, and maybe making that kind of troubling that a little bit. And a lot of this is coming because I've been tasked with doing more data analysis projects, and this will inevitably, from some well-meaning place, result in a request for a dashboard or some kind of interactive thing. So that's where my headspace has been, and is kind of where those requests come from, and what problems we think they'll solve, or what understanding they might impart or not to the stakeholders those tools are ultimately developed for. So researchers like Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein have been doing research and work on this for some time. So I'm using today 6 principles from their early articles on feminist data visualization, which first went to IEEE. That must have been an amazing session, and continued in a book that was published recently. So I will drop that article here in the chat, so that if you are someone who learns by reading, like I do, then you are welcome to look at that. And then also MIT, when MIT Press published their book on data feminism, made it open as part of their campaign for open as well. So what I'd like to do is take the principles that are outlined in the work of those 2 scholars and apply them to the data I work with in terms of visualization. So again, very broadly, data about the collection, and to an extent that's going to mean a certain amount of finance data. It'll mean how we measure open as a broad category of value too. And by that I mean, very broadly, open ed resources, open access, the infrastructure that we have open or enterprise underneath our collections to make them work and to do all that kind of connecty fun stuff. Oh, and if you're a developer and I just kind of hand wave your job as nifty, fun, connecty stuff, I'm really sorry about that, but that's actually what Ruby gems feel like to me. And so, and then memberships that we have too to open, to advance open strategically. So for example, our membership in Spark or the Library Publishing Coalition, or all of these things that we're kind of doing around open things really broadly. So what does a more holistic collections visualization look like? And then each of the principles that are outlined here have a number of suggested questions for the design process, and then the output questions in terms of how you interact with visualization that'll help. So those are pretty broadly rethink binaries, embrace pluralism, examine power, and aspire to empowerment, which might be my favorite because I spend a lot of time thinking about power and who has what in which context. But that second there, aspire to empowerment. So now that we know these things, what do we do about it? Consider context is the fourth, legitimize embodiment and affect, and then making labor visible. So I'll start with rethinking binaries. So in the process questions, we have things like, is our data the right kind of data for this project? What categories do we take for granted? How do we register responses that don't fit into categories we've provided? Anyone who's had to fill out a survey about gender knows that experience, or even your relationship, and how we do or don't capture those kinds of data points effectively, especially if they're edge cases or outliers. And then for an output question, when we do, send data off into the world, or send a visualization off into the world, how do we communicate the limits of our categories in the final representation? And we see this with long tail use in collections all the time, especially in demand-driven acquisitions models. So in terms of our binaries, we have that something is used or it's not used in the collection. We have things that are open. No, there are not slides you're supposed to be seeing because this is the new normal for me, at least during the pandemic. But thank you for checking, because that is exactly the kind of thing I would forget. You have used or not used, you see open or closed. In most cases, by closed we'll mean paywalled, but not everything we might measure in the collection is closed due to a paywall. In particular, if we're including data from areas that have access restrictions for whatever reason. So in particular, with data like counter data, there's already a caveat, because counter is designed to measure specific variables around access with a subset of data. So we're already looking at counter compliant data that measures different kinds of use that counter calls investigations in version 5. So we have a fairly limited sense of use, yes or no. Is it open, yes or no? And in some ways we have intensity through amounts of unique users or other kinds of bibliometric data we might get at. And there's all kinds of ways to visualize those that we're all familiar with, I think. But the concern still exists with the underlying data. Are the binaries that we have usefully describing activity in the collection? So you look at something like a JR1 report, and this gets a little into the weeds. My apologies for people who kind of, shut down at large Excel spreadsheets. I know I did for a long time. There's a few things that are already baked into that report and presented even encounters examples of how to use journal request report that excludes gold open access in order to calculate cost per use. So the first is that gold open access is somehow not being supported through a subscription agreement in some way, and as a result shouldn't be a factor when we're running analysis on that kind of use, which is a choice. But I don't see many dashboards that get into that granular take or even represent activity around open access resources, again, because we tend to measure things we paid for. I can get those figures and do some refining on my own, but it's worth noting here that the industry standard is shaping the framing of what resources have value and how libraries engage that proposition. So that's the first principle that I'm kind of going with. We see embrace pluralism. So when you design the stuff, who's being envisioned as the ideal user? And whose view of the world does that visualization represent? So if someone else is telling us what value is, we're going to try and represent that out and not necessarily define it for ourselves. but answer a question for maybe it's an administrator or someone else who is reading this idea of what impact is. So in trying to imagine, what a dashboard would look like, I wonder what would happen if we designed one that shifted views depending on the user. So that might allow us to code impact differently than just, sort of the movement of objects in and out of a building. For example, if we saw things that were just used in-house but not checked out, assuming that data is even collected, because in a lot of places it isn't. What if we saw patterns of engagement over time? In the past, I've been asked to just build a dashboard with no audience in mind and no parameters. And it's like being asked to write or speak without having that framework in mind. And yet a lot of times we'll engage in visualization around the collection in really similar ways, as though they operate outside human intervention and interpretation. And that's happening all the time when we put those, when we put that kind of data together in these representations. So we have examine power and aspire to empowerment. So can we enlarge our internal perspectives by employing more participatory design? And when are we making an assumption or placing kind of a moral framework on a design choice? So when we talk about openness or access, when might it also result in disempowerment? And I think in this context, that specifically, I think, is referring to a data set or things that maybe we don't necessarily have permission to access, but that's a kind of a whole other thing. For us here, that's meant building space for people that don't touch collections data in the same way to engage with the results. Because it's one thing to say that use or that this particular kind of data is one point of entry to understanding, and it's another to build that into how you're making decisions and ultimately how those are communicated to the rest of campus. So from a user standpoint, I think, and I'm coming at this from an academic library perspective, but we talk a lot about student success and tie all kinds of metrics to it, which is fine, but I'm kind of wonder when's the last time someone asked a student what that looks like and what students mean by success and how we're representing it there. Next is considering context. So lots of leveraging human-centered design and participatory design. What might we look at that? And in particular for the output of this, what kinds of terminology, symbols, and cultural artifacts have meanings to end users? And what might we learn if we were to visualize messy data? And honestly, I think it's okay if it's hard to describe. We should maybe lean into that and figure out what it looks like. I would rather have something that is a little bit messy or maybe less visually coherent to begin with than having something that is perfect or looks clean or communicates 100% what I meant. I want things to be a little messy and to fall outside of people's understanding. That's the sort of question or energy maybe that I would like. Fifth point is legitimizing embodiment and affect. And we actually do this all the time and it's really cool, but I want to do it in a data driven kind of context or a dashboard sort of context. So I'm interested to hear what other folks have to say about this. So when we look at what embodied or affective experience has to end users, so when we consider experiential or tactile or social ways of accessing data visualization, can we consider maybe different outputs? We do this pretty broadly with lots of us have things like daily question whiteboards or the love note or breakup letter to the library that the University of Arizona libraries did around Valentine's Day, or the sort of how much did your textbook cost signs covered in horrifying Post-it notes. But there are so many unexplored, I think, deeply experiential ways of accessing that distant read of how expansive library collections are. So as I sit down to build and analyze this thing, I'm thinking about this too. How do we make the story of the numbers more human? I'm going to drop into chat the this is a really good example of that kind of work is the version 2 of the Library of Missing Data Sets, which is done by an artist and their work about what data is, we would think should be available and isn't, or is deliberately not collected. Let me find the other one. There is a woman doing this work about femicides in Mexico, just based on news reports and local coverage and those kinds of stories, because there is no data set and no one is keeping track of it. And those are both really extreme examples in this context, but I think there are ways of again, making it so there are humans in our data and in the data we collect. And the last point is on making labor more visible. You know, and is it feasible to provide, you know, a visualization that shows the provenance of the data we're using? For example, if I do use counter data or circulation data or resource sharing, and where does that come from, and how do I, you know, represent that out? It would seem to me that it would be very possible to explain how many users something represents to maybe get at different forms of impact in ways that aren't invasive or infringe on user privacy. And so many of these kinds of projects, the works of our users and the work of the designers and the people that are putting these things together kind of vanishes. But we also disappear the, you know, what Sarah Lambden calls data brokers that are responsible for harvesting this information and handing it back to us in the name of impact. So there are good questions here, really solid approaches. I think that the feminist library dashboard can be a thing. And I'm looking forward to seeing, you know, kind of where this goes over the next, you know, few months sort of locally, what we might do at GVSU, and want to just leave the excuse me, I can't talk anymore, remainder of the time for Q&A. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Scarlett. We're going to go on to the next presenter, and we'll save Q&A until the end, if that's okay. Our next presenter is Bobby Smiley. He is the director of the Divinity Library at Vanderbilt University. His research interests include methods in history and digital humanities, disciplinary information literacy, tracking historiographical I cannot speak either, trends in American religious history, the institutional production of knowledge and disciplinarity, and exploring how digital humanities and academic librarianship can be usefully conjoined. He is currently working on a dissertation historicizing the relationship between libraries and digital humanities for a PhD in digital humanities from the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. Please welcome Bobby Smiley.
Thanks so much. And I actually do have one slide. So I can I go ahead and share the screen then?
You should be able to share that.
Okay, awesome.
Yes, I can see your slide. Great.
All right. Let's see. Well, I'm going to begin. I'm going to thank the panelists and thank the organizers of the panel for putting this together, and thank everybody for joining us. This is really exciting. Scarlett, your talk was amazing. And I have so many things that I'm thinking about now just based on some of the comments that you made. I'm going to sort of start obliquely and talk about one of the concepts that was mentioned in the description for the program of the panel. And that's this notion of algorithmic bias. And I'm going to kind of approach it sort of obliquely to talk about that, as well as how a data visualization project can kind of help highlight the and serve as a site for discussion and reflection. And so what you're looking at is a screen cap of where I live, Nashville. And it's from the Mapping Inequality project, which is based at the University of Richmond and is part of the American Panorama digital atlas of American history. And what this project provides is access to a series of rastered maps from the 1930s, which, as you can see, have been shaded in. And that shading in is based on a gradation that was developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was an entity created at the beginning of the New Deal in 1933 and lasted through the early 50s. And it was designed to provide, its mission was to provide low or no interest access to mortgage loans for credit-worthy folks. And the way in which credit worthiness and the value of homes, or where you could purchase homes, was determined was indexed to this color grade, the A through D grade. And as you can tell, the big major swath through the middle of the map is red, and red spots, not only in Nashville, but everywhere else, as you probably know, were considered what now we know as redlining. And I think, one of the things that a project like this highlights is that that redlining, of course, draws your attention to why this was done in the first place, which of course was to exclude large populations from access to any kind of loan or any kind of mortgage. And those populations almost exclusively, if not entirely, were communities of color, whether African-American communities, Asian communities, Latinos, or they were alternatively recent immigrant communities from Eastern Europe or Southern Europe. This map, to me, provides like a good entry point for talking about how a visualization project can be very useful in introducing or talking about notions of algorithmic bias, because even though it doesn't really seem like an example of that, the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance in their white paper defining algorithmic justice talks about redlining as actually a great example of a kind of pre-computational idea of an algorithm at work, which is to say a set of instructions, a set of criteria that are applied, and they're ostensibly sort of neutral or value-free, but they nevertheless are not, because they can't be divorced from the kind of prejudices and positionality of the folks who come up with them in the first place. So you can see how that criteria gets played out in this instance, which is not explicitly designed to separate out by race or ethnicity, but in fact does. This type of redlining, I think, is in this example is good to sort of show that it happens outside of a technological context, but within it, of course, I can think of the example, or I think of the work of Safia Noble in Algorithms of Oppression, where she talks about technological redlining, which is to say that profiling based on gender or race that's inscribed or cooked into things like search engines. But at the same time, this also provides us a kind of reminder that while this took place in the 1930s, or this is recording history in the 1930s, is nevertheless part of a longer trajectory that culminates today in, for instance, the Housing and Urban Development's suit against Facebook in 2018, where Facebook was harvesting data from users and selling it, and then that data was being used for targeted advertising related directly to housing, and that was done in a discriminatory manner in the sense that, insofar as the data was being tracked based on presumptions about the race of each of the users whom they harvested data from. That provides a kind of good, I think, example or object lesson in what Ruha Benjamin calls the new Jim Code. And if you're not familiar with her work, it's fantastic. She's a sociology and I think African-American studies professor at Princeton, runs the I.W. Wells Just Data Lab. If you haven't read Race After Technology, it's a great place to start if you're interested in exploring her work. I was thinking of the talk in terms of kind of a critical and constructive project, but I kind of want to, I'm sort of doing this live because I feel like some of my remarks probably don't fit necessarily within what we're talking about. And there are other things that I'd really like to actually plumb further. And so one of the things that I want to think about, or at least have us think about in terms of what the original, I think I remember a call included, was questions of pedagogy and social justice and data visualization, and how all those three interact and how we think about each one of them. The work that I've been doing with colleagues here at Vanderbilt, teaching a course on the ethics of information and looking specifically at misinformation and disinformation, one of the things that we do is we pull apart data visualizations and show how much they occlude as much as they try to as much as they try to reveal. And Scarlett mentioned this actually when we spoke collectively earlier, and reminded me of the work of Shannon Mattern and the idea of dashboard governance. And that is to say, this idea that, that all of these key performance indicators are there, and that it tidies up data and gives a kind of impression of agency and an interaction in a space where, of course, that data needs to be messy, or maybe it's obscuring things that the cleaning process is intended to obscure. But other things as well, and in particular, we reflect on the data qua data. And so one of the things that I think folks tend to think about when they think about data visualizations at its root is the composition or the composition of the data, the kind of questions that you can ask of it, and what Leland Wilkinson talks about with the grammar of graphics, which is the assembly, specification, and display. That specification, that part of reflecting on how whatever data you're using may be, or whatever method you're using to explore that data, may reify and reaffirm some of the things that you're trying to interrogate in the data visualization you're producing, or in many ways, or in some ways, sort of what Ruha Benjamin calls technological benevolence is reflected in endeavors to try to be sort of liberatory enterprises, but nevertheless tend to display or obscure in ways that that achieve the opposite, almost dialectically. So I'll just conclude by saying the work that I've been interested in exploring of late has been in connection to some of the themes that Scarlett hit upon in her talk. Entering the world of kind of moving from doing a lot of collections work and direct liaison work to doing more sort of middle managey stuff. I am aware of, as many of you are too, of the kind of neoliberal imperatives that libraries are asked to assent to, or at least produce statistics for, and the metric fixation that's so much a part of that. And the kind of dashboard governance is a good example of how that metric fixation gets played out, precisely because there's a focus on those key performance indicators. And one way to kind of reframe that would be to think about, well, what are the sort of metrics that we can, or measures, or areas of exploration that we can harness to not only kind of challenge orthodoxies or to provide a counter narrative, but also to raise awareness around what the library can do to explore those topics. And so I think, you know, that's one particular area among many that I find incredibly engaging, and I'm keen more so to explore. So upon that, I'll just stop and move on to the next speaker, please.
Thank you very much, Bobby. It looks like Catherine has not been able to join us live, so I will go ahead. If you could, Bobby, if you could stop sharing so I could share Catherine's pre-recorded presentation that she sent for us. And following that, we will open it up to questions. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and we will get to those following the presentation by Catherine.
So this is such an important topic.
Rachel, we might need your sound to hear it. We're not currently hearing anything.
And extremely important for libraries. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to be in this discussion group today. I've given this talk the title, What Becomes Data? To put the emphasis on a critical engagement with data over and above visualization. I've devoted a significant part of my career to data visualization. And I do believe it can be an extremely useful and powerful tool. But it's a knowledge representation that requires constant care and attention. Much of my work at Stanford has been in direct support of research. As my work has shifted to focus on library practices, I've noticed that while there is a practice of data analysis and visualization within libraries, it's focused on assessment, quarterly reports of what's coming in, what's going out, measuring circulation, use, and expenses. It's an application of business analytics to libraries. There's another important but underutilized application of data visualization that has emerged, not from the business world, but from our patrons, specifically digital humanists. Data analysis and visualization are tools that, when applied critically to collections in libraries and archives, can reveal quite a bit about the shape of the data. The shape in this case referring to what was collected and what was not collected. Simply by analyzing the metadata for collections, we can learn about the geographic distribution, the temporal distribution, gender bias and authorship, linguistic bias, and racial bias. In the Mapping Republic of Letters project, which started over a decade ago, it became glaringly apparent that early modern correspondence collections were oriented to the heroic male individual, whoever was considered worthy of collection in predominantly white Western institutions. So Voltaire, D'Alembert, Benjamin Franklin, etc. By analyzing Benjamin Franklin's correspondence over time and space, the historians who were working on that project could see more clearly through visualization of the data that many letters were missing from the collection. Letters, for example, that Franklin had written to his sister, which evidently had been deemed unimportant at some point, either by the funder, archivist, or institution. While the original case studies tended to focus on individuals, projects like Giovanna Cesaroni's work on the Grand Tour inspired young scholars who were then graduate students to engage critically with archives in new ways, to look carefully for absences, and begin to gather data themselves and define their own ontologies. And while white Western scholars had for years tended this notion that the Republic of Letters was an open, welcoming, extra-institutional space for the exchange of ideas, it was revealed through the visualization of correspondence networks to actually be quite parochial. I'll show an example here. So this is a screen capture of a tool that was developed for this Mapping Republic of Letters project. It's called NOT. And in this case, it's looking at a correspondence network starting with Jean-Laurent d'Alembert and expanding letter relationships, meaning these are nodes of people with whom he corresponded. So there's a lot of information behind those nodes. This is the metadata that I was referring to, but it helps to be able to organize and see the connections. You can see very much so this is, pretty much eco network. He's right in the center, and all we see are the notes of people that he's writing to. But as soon as we put in somebody else, in this case, David Hume, who happened to be in his network, you can start to see that there are, a few, but very few connections. And once we expand David Hume's network, then you can really see that not only are there not very many correspondents in common, but in fact, even with those correspondents in common, we can start to look into more details about who actually was involved and who's not. Now, this is a very particular example of using this kind of study of networks to understand this collection of letters, but it's the kind of thing that is now being done more and more as we start to look at relationships, measured relationships, say through word and document embeddings between novels, for example, between all kinds of different documents. And here, by again filtering down on different bits of metadata, we can start to see more about, as I was describing, the shape of the network, what are the different qualities, and how does it look in this case? D'Alembert's network is mostly based in France. And then whereas Hume's network, of course, is very much based in Scotland. So the visualizations, right, kind of shows this, that extant relationship. These tools are, they're interactive, right? And they can take you from this big picture view of the complexity of interconnections down to filtered views, like I was just showing, that focus attention on specific aspects of networks. Now, the key thing though is based on available metadata. And that of course brings us back to the data, which is the key. But the potential you can see here is for interactive visualization as a visual browser for collections, right? In this case, what we're looking at here is an example of a commercial product called Linkurious, which grew out of that tool, NOT, which has been used by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists to collaboratively interrogate these troves of documents of the Panama Papers in 2016, the Paradise Papers in 2017, more recently, the Pandora Papers, right? Exposing secret offshore accounts and uncovering all these different types of financial malfeasance around the world. So this idea of going, from the big picture to the small is pretty key for what I want to show you right now. This is a more recent project underway currently at Stanford. Felicia Smith, the Racial Justice and Social Equity Librarian at Stanford Libraries, has launched a project called No Systemic Racism. No Systemic Racism is a platform for data exploration and data access that's intended to enable users to discover factual data about interconnected systems that pose threats to people of African descent in the United States that have been shaped by racist policies and practices of institutions across centuries. So this project was driven by a need to show the data, to connect that data to people, to social action, and to legislation. And what we found is that the way that we structure and deliver data and documents in libraries makes finding the connections really difficult. While at the same time, the move to linked open data within libraries does provide an opportunity for us to make and reveal connections that extend beyond our own catalog to a societal network of information. So to give you an example of how we're applying these similar kinds of concepts. This exhibit, Say Their Names, was created by Felicia Smith after the killing of George Floyd. Right? The question that she posed, though, after creating this exhibit, which can be found at Stanford Libraries, this exhibit contains a number of different people who were killed, and it also connects, it creates stories. There's a lot of metadata embedded in these stories, but it's not connected, and they're not connected to each other. Right? So Felicia asked, how do we connect these memorials to the systems that have resulted in these deaths in many cases? And so, for example, we can think in this case of Oscar Grant, about on the left here is part of documents that we are bringing in on the founding of the state of California. So, we can look at white supremacist language and intention in these founding documents of the state of California on the model of the project at North Carolina, the On the Books project. And then bring that all the way forward to very recent documents, like on the right, Senate Bill 1421, which is state legislation that required the public release of police documents. This has subsequently resulted in the opening of new investigations into policing. And so here we're applying the same sort of tool to this data. And just like with D'Alembert, here we're opening with Oscar Grant. So this is the actual, not Oscar Grant, but the event of Oscar Grant being killed by Bart Peedy. And here you can see that we've got a map, so we can see in context. We can always move back and forth to that map view to see geographic context. And then we can expand the nodes by what are the organizations and other individuals and other events rather that are related to the killing of Oscar Grant. It starts to really, really change that understanding of, what's the information that we already have that's underlying. We can see this in a new way, right? That makes connections. Here, we're looking at this from a different view. So that Oscar Grant is a filtered view. The investigation was reopened, and that's where you can see that that's from Senate Bill 1421 having been passed. And it's not, of course, relating just to Oscar Grant's investigation being publicly released and then subsequently reopened. But that legislation had effect on a number of other deaths in California. So as we start to expand, now we can really start to get a sense that these things, these events, this documentation is connected. And in this case, you'll see on the left, we actually have a link through to that document. So this becomes what I was describing before as a visual browser. It's a visual browser to our collections, not simply a visualization that stands on its own. And in this case, what we're seeing is that there's extracted different values, entities, people, organizations, and locations extracted from this text. All right, so going back to that, actually, passing of SB 1421, we start to expand that to other events. And now you can see that, it also resulted in this investigation into Mario Woods and on, right? So we can start to expand out and again, see the connections and the relationships that are otherwise hidden in this kind of very formal, tabular data that's in our collections currently. Okay, so graph visualizations like that, of course, can be really difficult to navigate and to read. In this case, just as in the other cases for ICIJ and even for mapping Republican letters, the visualization is not the end goal, right? It's both a metaphor and an instrument for connecting data across siloed collections. It helps us redefine a structure that both defines and inhibits knowledge discovery. So to bring this back to data collection in the library, I want to leave you with some of the work of Mimi Unowaha. Her project, The Library of Missing Data Sets, for example, is something that we in libraries really need to give attention to. What do we choose to collect? What do we choose to preserve? And I'm suggesting that visualization of data and the preparation of data for the purposes of visualization can be one of the ways we can help ourselves understand what is missing in our data sets. Mimi Unowaha also offers some really excellent guidance as we can begin to see and work with our collections as data. Data sets are the results of their means of collection. As we collect more data, we prioritize things that fit patterns of collection. Data sets outlive the rationale for their collection. And related to that, especially combined data sets reveal far more than intended. Data collection is a transaction that is a result of an invisible relationship. How can we focus our attention on revealing this? Data visualization can be part of that process. Thank you very much. Appreciate this opportunity, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person.
Okay. So I hope everybody was able to hear that. I apologize for any technical difficulties. We didn't really know until this weekend that she was not going to be able to join us here today. So at this point, though, I want to see what questions have come through. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. But if anybody would like to ask a question, go right ahead at this point and do so. Anybody? Oh, and it looks like someone is sharing Nicole's email address. I just realized that I did not give the introduction to Nicole. Catherine Nicole Coleman is the digital research architect in research data services at Stanford University Libraries. She is also the research director at Humanities and Design, a research lab based at the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. At Humanities and Design, she has led the design and development of numerous tools for data visualization and analysis, including Palladio, Brevi maybe, and most recently DataPen. Among her scholarly work, she is the author of a 2020 article in the International Journal of Librarianship titled Managing Bias When Library Collections Become Data.
Hi, Rachel. This is Adla here. So, you know, I guess I have a big question, and that is how are we sharing this important work about library collections? And Scarlett, you know, I'm interested in both Bobby and Scarlett, you know, what you had to talk about library collections. When I think about library collections, you know, I don't always necessarily go directly to rare books and, you know, manuscript materials, archival materials, but also physical materials that we collect in the libraries. So I'm just, you know, it's just a philosophical insight, I guess. You know, how do we take this to the next level of awareness for people to dive into, you know, how are we responsible? Do we even know what all those connections are and how we're communicating or not communicating, or what is the message that we're sending or not sending? So big question, but what I would love to hear from you. Do you see, I guess, to narrow the question more, you know, do you see an opportunity for a broader conversation here that is not being optimized?
I'll say sure. I think the way in which those kind of, I mean, I confess that like in the past, my approach has been pretty naive. But that's okay. You got to start somewhere. And so using, I don't know, in my case, I started using just LCSH, Library of Congress subject headings, and what we had in each one of those areas as a way of kind of interrogating the collection, recognizing that each one of those is inscribed with its own history, that that reifies a certain type of collection, or encourages a certain type of collection. So that was a start. You know, within doing that, it was a way of illustrating to folks above me who were overseeing collections that there was a necessity, in my case, in the history collection, to expand in certain areas and to index the size of what we had in the holdings within one, say, for instance, subject heading versus another. I could make an argument that we could spend more money in one area versus another, or maybe dial back the amount of money we spend in one area and transfer it over to another. And the goal with that type of work was to, at least in my case, encourage us to have a much more diverse and inclusive collection, because we certainly didn't at the time. And this has been true both at where I worked beforehand and where I currently work. But I realized that that's just sort of like one kind of approach. And it's interesting to hear from folks today about the different ways of kind of conceiving of how you would approach that, because that seems to be, well, a useful or potentially useful start, just a small corner of a really big piece of paper.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
I see that some other questions have come in. What kind of steps can we take when creating metadata collections or making decisions about everything to support social justice and avoid just tracking what we have paid for?
So thanks for the question. And I see a Kent High School grad student is in the chat. And I went to Kent, so I see your question. I'll get to it in a second. So a lot of the systems that we use to measure those kinds of things are designed, like I mentioned earlier, to measure either did we pay for it or did we not pay for it? Because when we input, license resources into enormous systems like Alma, that's what it tells us back. So there has to be, I think, a conscious effort to build into the systems that we have to work with, to say explicitly, kind of build into that, to the time that we use to look at or clean, or even though clean is such a weird term for it, to kind of manage the data around those things, is how do we, for example, measure investment in open, or measure shifting toward open or different sorts of models, figuring out how to represent that in the systems that exist, and then being able to kind of tease those things out. But it's hard when, even if we put it on our calendars every year, suddenly ACRL and IPEDS is due. It's the same kind of frantic response. So figuring out how we're going to get that information out of existing systems is probably the one of the first ways to start, and that's going to come down to a lot of policy and who has who sort of has jurisdiction in those systems in order to be able to represent that data effectively. So that's one place where we can start. But I agree, we're more likely to count the things that are paid for with money, as opposed to, say, with labor or with other kinds of effort or exchange. So it's important to surface it.
Somebody just put, where are you publishing? I'm not sure who that was addressed to. Are either of you, I guess, publishing on this topic coming up? Then I see somebody's asking about the recording. As far as I know, everybody that registered for this event will receive a link to the recording once it is available. Here's the iSchool question. How can graduate students learn more on these social justice aspects of digital humanities, data visualizations, have taken an introductory course but want to learn more? Thanks.
I'm sure Bobby, you probably have really great responses to this too. But I was thinking, initially I thought of spaces like Data for Black Lives or Algorithmic Justice League, or the works that we sort of mentioned here, like Sophia Noble and Vera Benjamin and other folks that have done those kinds of talks, and also the artist who does do kind of the Library of Missing Data Sets. A lot of her early work has been public journalism on algorithmic bias and on the impact of absent data and those kinds of things. And I think you'll see quite a bit of projects around sort of like the things that Bobby was mentioning about redlining, and early sorts of things where we're looking at, okay, we're going to take data, apply a set of rules to it, and then this will be the output. You see that in things like Robert Moses, and all of his sort of history and work. So those I think would be good places to start. And like I mentioned, the data feminism text is actually open and available, although I'm sure Kent has an EPUB copy as well. So I think more so looking at the groups that are doing the work and that are on the ground trying to kind of elevate and reify, like, here's what's happening as a result. Lots of environmentalism and climate activism takes place in this kind of space too. Like, what exactly are we visualizing when we say that? And I think increasingly public health, thanks CDC dashboard, will also engage a number of folks in that space as well.
And I'll just mention that one of the really cool things that I saw in the last couple of years was NC State sponsored a student contest, basically a student contest, to come up with different types of visualizations, partially informed by looking at the W.E. Du Bois visualizations that he developed with a team for the 1900 Paris Exposition, but also just looking at pressing issues related to social justice around housing, around race, around environmental concerns. And it gave me a really good sense, and I'm sure the students a really fantastic opportunity to kind of see how one puts together a great visualization, but also just to think about a lot of the allied issues that are a part of that, in a way to kind of empower the students in that conversation too. But the visualizing, I think there's visualizing impact is pretty good. Also anything, and I found a lot of resources and sort of side projects connected with the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab at Princeton, which was sponsoring, for instance, the defining algorithmic justice white paper that I mentioned.
All right, thank you both. Some more questions coming in. What can be done to minimize bias when collecting data sets prior to visualization?
You almost need a scope statement for data sets. I was trying to think of some word to sort of describe it, but I think the way, even if they're just sort of free, right, and out in the world, and then they get ingested and presented to users and people we're trying to serve as, here's a data set you can use, that there should also, be kind of a scope statement for that. Like we're in the process of buying, a couple of data sets in Wharton, Research Data Services, and so I wonder where the scope is in that, or if we cite a data set, what version of it, where's the sort of provenance of that, if it's sort of a continuous thing. Someone in chat says that's such a big question, since so much of the problem of the bias is inherent in the recording of the data itself, right? And I think that the control we have over it is maybe what kinds of questions are we asking when we collect this kind of data, and that intersects with the privacy concern as well, which is, why do we need this? What's the research question behind collecting this data? Sort of the opposite of the presentation on the Republic of Letters at Stanford. Well, what is or is not important? Is Franklin writing to all of these people that aren't Jefferson, for example, that all of those things, represent still a totality of communications and networks and things that were then, kind of underexplored. So a lot of it depends on the basis of the question that you're asking too, but I kind of want scope notes for all our data sets now.
I'll just echo and agree completely that some kind of scoping note, some kind of genealogy of how this data got here, how it was selected, what wasn't selected, what was privileged in the collation of that data, but also then the bigger conversation, and I find this often to be the case with any kind of with any kind of data visualization enterprise, is really the kind of question you want to ask and the kind of question your data enables you to ask. And I don't think far too frequently, there's a kind of an end goal with display that supersedes the best kind of visualization method or the most appropriate mode of analysis to get there. And I totally understand that, because we want an arresting image, we want to convey something in a punchy kind of engaging way, but oftentimes it's really that very complicated or difficult to identify research question that that makes the best kind of visualizations, but also in certain cases completely changes the direction in which you think you're going. So yeah, interrogating, for instance, methods. I mean, I can think of times where I thought, oh, I'll just drop this all in Gephi and make a network graph, and which unlike, I say that as a point of contrast to the kind of work that was done in the Republic of Letters, because that was very intentional and mine was just sort of exploratory and a little naive. But, you know, that's because I wanted to make a network graph. It's not because I really wanted to understand this data. And then you get issues of confirmation bias and so on. So really, it's concentrating on those questions, as Scarlett said.
It looks like the questions have stopped rolling in. I just want to take this moment to thank all of our presenters, Bobby, Scarlett, and Catherine. I also want to thank the people on our committees from EBSS, Alex Hodges, Hannah Park, Jordan Sly, and from DSS, Dr. Erla Haynes, Caitlin Bagley, Tara Hagan, Dr. Rachel Starry, and of course, ACRL and Alois for all of your work. Thank you all so much for joining us, and be looking for the recording of this presentation coming from Alois probably in the next week or so. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.